Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Peter Goddard, Director of the Institute for Advanced Study, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's talk, which is held under the auspices of the Einstein Legacy Society. The membership of the Society recognizes those who, following the example set by Albert Einstein, have included the Institute in their estate plans. And I'd like to begin by thanking Charlie and Rosanna Jaffin and Marty Children, who cannot be with us tonight, for their leadership of the Einstein Legacy Society throughout the 15 years since this important group was established in 1996. As a completely independent institution, fostering fundamental research that's driven by the intellectual curiosity and imagination of its faculty and members, rather than being constrained by short-term, predetermined objectives, the Institute has been dependent throughout its history on the generous support, including planned gifts, of its trustees and friends, faculty and members. Most of us, with careful planning and professional advice, are capable of supporting the institutions that we care about by including them in our estate plans. In many cases, these plans can also provide a stream of income and tax benefits for ourselves and our families. I hope you'll think about making a planned gift to the Institute and so becoming a member of the Einstein Legacy Society. Katie Newcomb, who's in charge of planned giving for the Institute, will be very happy to provide information or advice about making bequests or other planned gifts. The Einstein Legacy Society is about ensuring that this institution, which has a rich history and great achievements and is today uniquely creative and exciting, has a secure future. But tonight we're going to hear something about that rich history from our speaker, Linda Arntzenius, whose book on the Institute for Advanced Study in the Images of America series was published by Acadia Publishing last month. Linda is exceptionally well qualified to be the author of this pictorial history of the Institute, concentrating on the first 50 years of its history. She was a member of our public affairs staff from 2003 to 2006, when, amongst much else, she produced the very successful brief introduction to the Institute and its history, known to the community as the Blue Book. You can get copies of that in the Common Room, for example. But Linda's interest in the Institute goes back a lot further, to when she was a student at the London School of Economics, studying logic and the history of science, and became interested in the work of John von Neumann and Kurt Gödel. To add to all this depth of background about the Institute, for the last 2 or 3 years, Linda has taken forward our oral history project, interviewing past faculty, staff, and others connected with the Institute. In fact, I'm sure she knows things about us that nobody else does. After her talk, Linda will answer questions. Linda.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that wonderful introduction. I had a problem this evening because almost everyone in this room has a copy of the book, courtesy of the Institute for Advanced Study. So I had to wonder what I was going to talk about. So I decided that instead of showing slides of the contents of the book, I thought I would talk a little bit about the book and share with you some of the stories that I heard along the way, a few discoveries, and some of the images that didn't make it into the book. But first of all, I do have to take a few moments to thank the Institute staff, particularly those in the archives, in the Historical Studies Social Science Library, and in the Office of Public Affairs. I couldn't have done the book without their assistance, and first and foremost, of course, Christine DeBella, the Institute's archivist, and archival assistant Erica Mosner. Erica and I spent weeks looking through boxes and boxes of photographs, and I have to thank Erica for literally hundreds of scans that she produced, following the rather stringent requirements of Arcadia Publishing. And I also have to thank Peter Goddard. The book would not have been possible had he not given me access to the archives, and I've done my best to live up to his considerable expectations. Besides the Besides the archives here and at Bryn Mawr and Caltech, I use several other sources. The Historical Society of Princeton, the Department of Rare Books and Special Collections at Princeton University, Newark Public Library for images on the Bambergers, for example. But I was particularly lucky to find two local people who had compiled their own histories of the Institute, Louise Morse and Gary Alvin. Now, Louise, everyone knows. Yes. Louise is going to be 100 this June. I hope you don't mind my sharing that little bit of information. And I'm very grateful to Louise. The book is dedicated to her because she always encouraged me. And not only did she allow me to look inside her photograph albums, she allowed me to take them away so that I could scan them. And you can see Louise's photograph albums are a history of the mathematical community in Princeton. You can see Marston and Louise, if I can, is this the pointer? Yep, there you go. And here we have Oswald Veblen. And here, of course, we have Adelot, Einstein, Marston Morse again, Alexander Weil, and Veblen, and Einstein. These pages show you how much information is contained in Louise's albums. And you can't be expected to recognize everyone, but there's the leading mathematicians from all over the world in Louise's books. Images of Oswald Veblen are among those drawn from Louise's books that are in the Images of America book. And you can see not only did she collect photographs and take photographs, she also put in clippings, and she also, which is wonderful for historians, included names and dates, and sometimes these are annotated on the pages, sometimes they're on the backs of the photographs, but there's tons of information there, so that was an absolute gift to be able to go through Louise's material. I was also very thrilled to find Gary Alvin. I had hoped he would be here tonight, but I don't see him. Gary worked at the Institute for many years, and when I heard that he was never seen without a camera in his hand, I got very excited. I sought him out, and he very graciously invited me to his home in Trenton, where he shared at least a dozen big, fat, bulging albums. Not all of them the Institute, most of them family, but a lot of photographs that are candid snapshots rarely shown of professors. Maybe you recognize some of these people. Who do you see? Harry Wolff, Patsy LaBaum, Murph Goldberger, and note the the computer, one of the first. This lady is Aida Labrute, and apparently she worked in the director's office. And this lady is Barbara Radebush, who I think also worked in the director's office at some point in time. And of course everyone recognizes Momota and Dottie Farres, yes. And here are more of Gary's images, from picnics to pig roasts. Here we have a pig roast. I don't know if the Institute still does pig roasts, but, and this is Mary Jane. And anyone else? Caroline. Is Caroline here? Ah, Caroline Underwood. So that was fun, actually, going through Gary's, what I think of as a family album of the Institute. Lots of photographers have been through the Institute also, and Cliff Moore, of course, allowed me to use some of his images. And Bruce White, of whom I'll say more later. Uli Stelzer, who had a studio in Princeton in the 1960s and who photographed Robert Oppenheimer on many occasions and became a mentor of sorts to his son Peter and also to Randolph. Is it Hank, your brother? What's his name? Randolph? Roderick. The book's focus is the first 50 years of the Institute, from 1930 to 1980. But I departed a little bit from this rule on occasions, using more recent photographs when I needed to illustrate aspects of the Institute for which there were no archival images. So most of the newer ones are towards the end of the book, the last 2 chapters on campus life and buildings and grounds. I'm very grateful to photographer David Graham for showing us that Einstein isn't the only Institute professor who's comfortable on a bicycle. They're both wonderful shots. Randall Hagedorn is another professional photographer. I discovered that before he became a professional photographer, he actually worked here at the Institute in the print room. He started out working in the basement of Fould Hall, operating an offset printing press with a man called John Harris. He was 18 years old, it was his first job, and not only did he allow me to use photographs for the book, but he told me a lot of stories. Mike Morgan, I don't know if anyone remembers Mike Morgan, one-time mayor of the borough who worked at the Institute for many years. Mike Morgan had noticed that this young 18-year-old went out for a walk every lunchtime. He walked in the Institute woods. So in the fall of 1962, Mike called him over and said, you know, there's an elderly gentleman here, and we're a little bit worried, you know, it's getting icy, and he's always deep in thought. He'd like to walk in the Institute woods at lunchtime. Would you go along with him? No speaking, no talking unless you're talked to. Well, the gentleman happened to be Paul Dirac, the Nobel laureate, P.A.M. Dirac. And that was Randall's job from fall of 62 through the spring of 1963 to accompany this elderly gentleman who actually was probably only in his 60s at that point in time, so not that elderly. But besides Dirac, Randall also came into contact at that time with Helen Dukas, because at that time she was working in the basement of Fould Hall, also in a huge vault that was down there that had been built there specifically to house the papers of IAS director Robert Oppenheimer when he was doing top secret work with the Atomic Energy Commission. So Randall's job was to open the big vault door, let her in. There was a little desk in there that she worked at. At the end of the day, she'd come out, say goodbye. He'd close this big, heavy vault door. And I discovered another person who had been doing exactly the same thing just a few years earlier. That's Hank Pannell, who also worked in the print room. It's amazing how much talent went through that print room. And Hank lives in Princeton. He lives in the Jackson Witherspoon Street neighborhood, and he was wonderful in telling me stories about walking in the Institute woods and feeling safe there. And also helping Miss Dukas in and out of the vault. In fact, she actually gave him the combination so that he could open it for her. Besides fond memories of the Institute and the woods, Hank is among those Princeton residents who can recall a child's eye view of Albert Einstein. This tiny figure is Einstein walking between his home at 112 Mercer and his office in Fould Hall. Einstein often visited Hank's Jackson Street, Witherspoon Street neighborhood, where he'd sit in his white sneakers, no socks, baggy sweatshirt, on Hank's grandmother's porch, Occasionally, Hank told me he'd reach into his pocket for a nickel for one of the local kids. Someone somewhere in Princeton must have photographs of Einstein's visits to the Jackson Witherspoon Street neighborhood, but as yet they remain to be discovered. One other member of the local community who remembered Einstein vividly was Alice Satterfield. And I had the privilege of interviewing Alice last year, just a few weeks before she died. Alice, whose daughter Shirley is here tonight. Hi, Shirley. Alice worked in the kitchen when the cafeteria was on the 4th floor of Fould Hall. Now, that was in the 1940s. And Alice described how she often walked home with Einstein. They didn't say much, but often they held hands. Now, you have to remember, this was an era of segregation in theatres and on buses, and Alice told me that the Institute bus, unlike others around here, had people from all over the world, and you could sit anywhere you liked. Her daughter Shirley, she was just a little thing at the time, but she remembers coming up to the Institute, going up to the kitchen. She remembers Einstein, going for little walks with Einstein. But I'm sure, Shirley, that those olives that you were given from a big jar probably made just as much impression on you as Einstein did at that time. If I have one regret, it's that the only version of this picture was too low resolution for me to use in the book. Here is Alice Satterfield. I don't know the names of the other ladies. I do know that this lady was called Zeta Boone. But that's all I know about this era and this photograph. However, the picture is included in a book, as are Alice's reminiscences and Hank's reminiscences, in a book titled Einstein on Race and Racism by Fred Jerome and Roger Taylor. And it's a wonderful book, and it mentions the Institute as well. I would like to have used that one. But there are several other pictures I couldn't use, either because they weren't available to me at the time or because they were too low resolution. Of the former are these from a young lady called Archival Condopria. She worked as a secretary to Herman Goldstein on the electronic computer project. You know, people, members in particular, often talk about coming to the Institute and it changing their lives. Well, this young woman came to the Institute to work here. She was 17 years old. She was straight out of high school. And it completely changed her life. It exposed her to scholars. It exposed her to a huge world. She lived on, she got accommodation on, not Battle Road, one of the side streets along here, the one going down to by the golf course. And it opened her eyes. She came to the Institute recently and shared these photographs with me. One of the highlights of her period here was that she found she got an invitation to Saturday, March 13th from 8 o'clock, drinks, dance, food at the von Neumann's. And she remembered what she wore. This made a huge impression on Archival. And she's sitting at a Varityper, a machine that was used to type up the von Neumann's reports. Those reports were very important in the development of the early computer. So she has her place in history too. One other photograph I was sorry not to be able to use was this one. Cécile de Witt Moret, French mathematician and physicist. She was here in 1948 to 1950 and went on to found the Summer School for Theoretical Physics in France. And that was a disappointment. It was too low resolution for me to use. I tried to sneak them in and I tried to persuade the publisher that couldn't they do something? Couldn't they work some magic? But no, they couldn't. Well, so much for my disappointments. Now for some happy discoveries. I was particularly keen to find photographs of archaeologist Hetty Goldman, who was appointed in 1936, and also of the German-born medieval historian Ernst Kantorowicz. I could find no image of Ernst in the archives. But as luck would have it, I found them both quite unexpectedly, while researching what I thought at the time was a rather peripheral connection to the Institute. I had seen an article about the friendship between Einstein and this lady here, Alice Kahler, better known as Lily. Some of you might remember her. She lived until 1992, I believe. Alice Kahler was the wife of Erich von Kahler, who had been a member in the School of Historical Studies in the summer of 1949. So I was looking through these papers. The Kahlers lived at One Evelyn Place, and they'd been great hosts during the 1950s. Thomas Mann, Einstein, the American artist Ben Shahn were among their circle of friends. Lily's article led me to this file of papers containing handwritten documents in tightly scripted German, which was a bit of a challenge for me, but then I was looking for photographs, fortunately. So I ploughed on, and eventually I came across a box of about 120 slides. Off to the top of Bainbridge House I went to examine slides over the bulb box that they have up there. After going through lots of holiday snaps, I discovered a rather distinguished-looking gentleman. There was nothing to indicate who he was, but he looked like somebody. He just had to be somebody. Anyway, I dutifully replaced the slide, made a note of where it was, and continued. When I came across him again, his name was written on the side of the slide. He was Ernst Kantorowicz. This was the slide, and this is Erich Kahler. I got to know this house quite well. There were lots of slides of this house. This is Evelyn Place, Erich Kahler, and this is Ernst Kantorowicz. I'm never sure whether it's Kantorowicz or Kantorowicz. Does anyone know? Kantorowicz? Okay, Kantorowicz. Well, that was a very good day. I also found Hetty Goldman in the same batch of slides, and I was delighted to have this rather informal portrait of her at her vacation home in upstate New York. It's on page 56 of the book. And there are 3 images of Hetty in the book, and I make no apologies for that. She was, after all, the only woman on the faculty for almost 50 years until Joan Wallach Scott was appointed in 1985. Each small discovery spurs you on, as does each shared reminiscence. So many of the people I spoke with had stories about Einstein, and I would like to share one from a former Institute member who is now in his 80s. Victor Shapiro is now 85, and he's Distinguished Professor in Mathematics Emeritus at UC Riverside in California. But in 1953, when Gabby Borel took this photograph of Einstein, Victor Shapiro was a young professor in the math department at Rutgers, and he was looking forward to 2 years with no teaching responsibilities as a member in the School of Mathematics. Through the efforts of Marston Morse, Shapiro had received a National Science Foundation Fellowship. And like other young academics lucky enough and talented enough to spend time at the Institute, he was relishing the opportunity to get to grips with some of his subject's thornier problems. But as he and his wife struggled to enter Fould Hall, pushing their 10-month-old daughter in a stroller, it was the Institute's doors that were causing the problem. Just a few feet behind the Institute's heavy front door, there's another little vestibule swinging door. But as luck would have it, 2 gentlemen were coming from the opposite direction, and each held open a door. Shapiro immediately recognized one of them was Kurt Gödel, and the other, of course, was Albert Einstein. That was his first day at the Institute for this Victor Shapiro. Can you imagine? In a phone interview, Victor also told me about his 10-minute interview with Oppenheimer, which I understand was then standard practice for members. His one regret, he told me, was that he didn't thank Oppenheimer for saving his life. You see, Shapiro was part of the infantry division that was set to invade Japan in November of 1945. That was until the atomic bomb was dropped and the invasion became unnecessary. Shapiro had been in an anti-tank company, and he had seen 23 of his friends killed. So from his point of view, Oppenheimer had saved his life. Shapiro also recalled many conversations about mathematics with Kurt Gödel, several of them conducted while traveling on the Institute's bus. Gödel lived on Linden Lane in town. People say all sorts of things about Gödel, Shapiro told me, but I found him to be a regular guy. That's the only time I've ever heard Kurt Gödel described as a regular guy. Well, incidentally, Shapiro and his wife also learnt to dance while they were at the Institute. Louise, can you guess who taught them to dance? Marston Morse taught them to Charleston. Well, as wonderful as these shared stories are, I was compiling a pictorial history. And to tell a story, I had to have a photograph. Now, I got around this somewhat by incorporating some of the anecdotes into captions. For photographs of Einstein, for example, I include Barbara Rose's story in a caption on page 37 and Andrew Leonard's story in a caption on page 41. Barbara Rose is the little girl who lived a few doors away from Einstein, and she's the one who called him Dr. Iodine. And she complained to her mother that it wasn't fair that she had to wear boots while Dr. Iodine could walk about in all weathers without even any socks. I think she was about 8 at the time. Well, with so many interesting people to talk to, you can imagine how challenging it was for me to keep on track. One of the most pleasant aspects of working on this book, it was challenging too, was the connection made with ordinary people. Actually, I've written here extraordinary people, and that's what I mean, extraordinary people, who allowed me to use their photographs and share their experiences. People like former member David Kennedy, whose aerial shot opens this book. David was a member in the School of Historical Studies in 2005, when he flew over the Institute. He's an archaeologist who teaches at the University of Western Australia, and for 30 years he's been flying over Jordan, discovering archaeological sites buried by time and sand. Most recently, he's been in the news because he's been using Google Earth to look at places, little gaps over Saudi Arabia, and using his expert knowledge, he's been discovering archaeological sites buried in the sand in Saudi Arabia. Amazing science, facilitated by periods of research at the Institute. Now, I'm telling you about him to show you just how many opportunities there were for me to be sidetracked. It would have been all too easy for me to take Einstein's hand and go off with him. The same goes for Oppenheimer, von Neumann, Panofsky, Gödel, Veblen, Hirschman, Hetty Goldman. I had to remember that my job was not to give a complete history of the Institute, but a pictorial history that would yield a glimpse of the place to outsiders, the general public, who, unlike people here, have no access to the inside and only the vaguest idea as to the Institute's purpose and history. The book is part of a series that is tightly focused on the local. It's meant for a Princeton and New Jersey audience, and I have to confess it's a rather idiosyncratic selection intended to offer the general reader an understanding of this many-faceted institution. I am convinced that there are many more images out there, and many that speak to the extraordinary history of this extraordinary place. And if this small book does anything to prime the pump, so to speak, if it gets people looking into their attics, into their albums, I think that would be a gratifying outcome. And just to show you that images are still out there to be discovered, I'd like to share these two of Einstein. that were found recently by a photographer of the name Bruce White. Bruce found these among the private collection of New Jersey photographer and collector Gene Collard. And as archivist for the West Caldwell Public Library, Bruce is doing much to preserve Collard's legacy. And while these don't appear to be Collard's work, I think you will agree that they are a wonderful discovery. I have a feeling they might be by Lottie Jacobi, but that's a mystery for Bruce to solve. And I share them to show you that you just never know what's going to turn up. As you know, Albert Einstein's scientific legacy continues at the Institute. His legacy is one of excellence, to be sure, but it's also one of fun, as these photographs attest. But Einstein was not the only one to have fun. Here's a photograph that I have to say didn't make it into the book, from Marina von Neumann-Wittmann, showing her father. And Marina calls this photograph Father in Party Hat. And the party hat looks to me to be made out of an oxygen mask and a bit of rubber tubing from a laboratory. No idea what the occasion was, but there you go. And the fun continues today. Oh, I missed one. Here we have Nobel Prize-winning economist Eric Maskin celebrating Halloween at 112 Mercer Street. So this just lets you see that Nobel Prize-winning economists also let their hair down from time to time. And I think on that note, it's high time for me to leave you and simply thank our hosts and thank you all for coming. Ah! Forgot about that. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Peter.
Well, thank you very much, Linda. I know the Institute's very, very pleased to have this book made about us, and we're very grateful to Linda for all her hard work, and I know many people here will share that. But now Linda is willing to answer some questions, if you have questions. Are there questions?
What was the impetus for the project? What was the very beginning?
Oh, several people have asked me how did the project come about? And I happened to be in Borders Bookstore, fall of 2009. And there were 4 Arcadia authors there that night, one of whom, Richard Smith, has authored 3 books on Princeton, one on Princeton University. Apart from the Images of America series, there's a campus history series, and 2 on Princeton, I think one called Princeton and one called Princeton Then and Now. And so I was looking at the books. I'd always been attracted to them in Barnes & Noble. They have them on a stand. They look very much the same, but they entice you to pick them up. And so I got talking with him, and he told me of the that Arcadia were very nice to work with, and I began to think, this would be a nice project. But the funny thing is, the Institute, you would think, would come to my mind immediately, but it didn't. Los Angeles City Hall came to my mind, which seems absurd, but I had lived in LA for 10 years, and I had worked on the architects of early 20th century Los Angeles, and I'd done a lot of work on City Hall, and I hate leaving projects unfinished. When I left LA, I had all of this material, and it didn't go anywhere, and I guess in the back of my mind, there was always this looking for a place to put it. But when I got home, I realized that LA is 3,000 miles away, and there's a subject right here under my nose. So that's how it came about. And I approached the publisher first of all to see if they were interested, and then I had to come to Peter and ask if they would be willing to allow me to to do this, and I'm eternally grateful that you did. Thank you.
I'm sure you're still looking, and what would be the photograph you come across where you say, Eureka, this is it?
Well, oh gosh, I love the early photographs. I love the ones that have, the top people, Einstein, Adelot. I love this on the cover because, it was hard to choose the cover. There's another photograph that has Einstein and Flexner, who, after all, it was Flexner who instigated the process. But I liked putting this one on the cover because of Adelot. I kind of fell in love with Adelot. I think maybe it's his ears. It's those ears. It's those ears, Freeman. And he was so different from Flexner. Flexner was very autocratic. I think perhaps rather difficult to work with. And I think Adelot did a lot to build community and make this a more pleasant place to be. I have no idea if that answered your question.
You'll know when you find it.
Yes. So.
I have a question I'm asking. I suppose that you've been asked by this or that person, why wasn't there a photo of so-and-so or so-and-so?
Yes.
Whose photo was the most missed?
Whose photo was the most missed? Gosh, well, no, I've got him. Whose photo was the most missed? I think maybe Hasler Whitney. I went through a community of scholars, the book, up to 1980, it stops. And I checked off everybody that was in. At first I was determined to have a picture of everyone on the faculty. I do have every director. And I just couldn't do it because I got probably 90%. But others, either I didn't have a photograph or I didn't have one that was of the right quality. And also there was a problem. Had I pursued that, I would have ended up with a Facebook of heads with accomplishments. And while that's a worthy thing to do, I wanted to do more than that. I wanted to give a feeling for the atmosphere of the place and show people living here, working here, eating here, not just the accomplished faculty. That I hope I have done. Again, I had to go to more recent photographs to achieve that. And many of the photographs had to do multiple work. There's a photograph, for example, page 112, this photograph of Patricia Crone, Eric Maskin, Natty Seiberg, and Martin Novak. Now, the reason this one is here is because I wanted to mention Amias. So this photograph does a lot of work. It mentions Amias, it includes 4 faculty, and it also mentions public lectures, because I felt that was something important that the outside world needed to know, that there were moments when people who could come onto the campus to go to public lectures and to go to music program. I think the same reason goes for the picture of Bill Scheide and Robert Taub. It allowed me to mention the music program. So it was difficult sometimes to leave photographs out. But I don't really have any regrets for the ones that have not made it in. I would like to have been able to put more in. I have no index. Had I had an index, I would have not been able to put in so many pictures. I hate books without indexes. However, I wanted to have more photographs.
So
and
you had a limit of pages?
Yes, this is a very strict, tight format, and at times I felt brutal in forcing these accomplished people into 70-word captions. I mean, it felt awful at times. But the book is what it is. It's a strict format, 128 pages, 18,000 words maximum, 70 words maximum per caption, and my captions are 70 words on the nail. I used every single word that I could. Never missed an opportunity. You got a little more if you shared a caption between two photographs. So where I could share a caption, I did so.
I'd just like to say that I was an undergraduate at Princeton in the special program in the humanities, and Ernst Kantorowicz came and gave a lecture.
Oh, really?
And of course, I didn't understand a word of it, but I do remember his ending.
Yeah.
And Virgil, with his crown and mitre, was ruled by his own humanity. Thank you.
Oh. That's amazing. Any other one?
Have you considered doing a book about another major Princeton institution, Princeton Theological Seminary?
Well, it's funny you should say that because I have. I was just.
To be a trustee.
Oh, well, I will talk to you later. Yes, yes.
And it goes back almost 200. It'll have its bicentennial.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Yeah. I just on the way here, I was saying, Princeton Theological Seminary. Oh, that's amazing. Anyone else? Freeman.
Well, just a suggestion for the missing photograph.
Yes.
John Tukey conducting the square dances in South Hall.
That would be great. Do you have a photograph?
No.
Oh, that makes my point. Helen.
You must have collected a lot of photographs that you've not used.
Yes.
Have they all gone now into the archives?
Well, most of them are in the archives. Oh, and those that I've collected, yes, I put, for example, Ingrid Selberg gave me some, which I have pushed into the archives, and Marina von Neumann-Whitman, several. I think you may have them anyway, but and if there are others, I'm happy to do that. It's not a problem. Yeah, and the ones of the Bambergers. Yes, I think these will all be in the archives at some point.
And as you mentioned, I'm the archivist for the Institute, and I'd certainly like to make a plug for people giving things to the archives. We're very interested in a lot of what we have represents the official life of the Institute, and we don't have as much about all the human interactions that went on here and the candid moments that went on. And Linda has certainly, as she said, funneled some wonderful things to us. We've gotten some wonderful donations recently from Gerda Panofsky, and Charlotte Langland shared some material related to Crossroads with us. So we're always on the lookout for things like that, and certainly if you have things like that, please consider giving them to the archives.
Other questions? Well, let us thank Linda again both for her marvelous book and for this great talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.